Hello, today I'm going to show you how to make this jumper. It is so easy, so adaptable as well. So like once you've nailed the technique, you can make so many different versions of this jumper. I'll show you a few examples of what I've made, hopefully while I'm talking now. This is my absolute favorite style of jumper to make just because it starts looking like a jumper so quickly. Like when you're working on it, you know you're making a jumper. You're not having to like knit and crochet different panels and then stitch them together to make them a jumper. It just is already a jumper, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does. I'm gonna stop rambling because I could talk forever. We can just dive straight into the tutorial. So for this jumper, I used the Hobbii Fluffy Day XL yarn. I think this is the colour Jade. I'd call it maybe more of like a eucalyptus colour, but I think on the website it's down as Jade. I will say with this yarn, I think the tighter the stitch, the better it looks. I think if you use too loose a stitch, it can become quite gappy and look quite ratty quite quickly. So the tighter the stitch you use, the better the jumper looks for longer. So for this jumper, I used an 8mm hook, and I really wouldn't go any bigger than that. But I've made jumpers with like a 5mm hook and things like that. So it's really your choice. For me, 8mm worked fine, but I just kept the tension quite tight. So as always, we're going to start off with a slip knot. I'm not the best at describing how to do this, so maybe just watch this as many times as you need. Then we're going to chain 40. You don't have to do 40. I found that this was the right size for me. You basically want to make sure it's big enough to fit over your head. I would keep it an even number, but it doesn't have to be 40. This just worked for me and actually made it easier when it came to putting in stitch markers. But yeah, just make sure it fits over your head. Then once your chain is the length you want it to be, we're going to slip stitch into our first stitch on the chain. So basically you want to push your hook through your first stitch, yarn over, then pull the yarn through both the loops on your hook. Then we want to chain up twice and turn our work. For this jumper, I'm using what I think is called a half double crochet stitch. I'm not the best with stitch names, so this is what I've been calling it. It might be called something completely different. So basically, I'm yarning over, I'm pushing my hook through a chain, I'm picking up more yarn the other side and pulling it back through the chain. I'm then yarning over again and pulling that through all the loops already on my hook. It sounds complicated, it's really not. It's probably just my description, but I would just watch it as many times as you need to, slow it down if you need to, and then just give it a go. I always find it's a lot easier once you've actually got some yarn in your hand and you're trying it. So just watch it as many times as you need to, but once you get the hang of it, it's a really good stitch to use. When we get back to our first stitch, we just want to slip stitch into our first stitch. So again, you do this by pushing your hook through your first stitch, picking up some yarn and pulling that back through, and then again back through the loop on your hook. We're then going to chain up twice, turn our work, and continue a new row. On this row, we're actually going to add in some stitch markers, and this is going to show us the points that we need to increase at each row. I like to put my stitch markers spaced evenly every 10 stitches. So this is why I did my initial chain 40 stitches long, because then I knew there would be 10 stitches between each of my 4 stitch markers. Again, your starting chain doesn't have to be 40 stitches long, but as long as you can evenly split it at this point, it doesn't matter. Once you've inserted your stitch markers, you can then crochet around to your first stitch marker. So once we get to our stitch marker, we're going to do an increase. And to do this increase, we're going to do one of our usual stitches into this stitch. We're then going to do a chain, and then we're going to do another stitch into the same stitch. So for every increase, we're basically doing a stitch, a chain, and another stitch, all into the one stitch in the row before. This gets easier after the first row because where we do that chain stitch, it creates a bit of a gap, and we then do our increases into that gap. And it's a lot easier to see and to fit your stitches into. As always, we're going to finish our row by slip stitching into the first stitch, chaining up twice, turning our work, and continuing crocheting in the round. So here we've come across our first increase from the row before. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our last normal stitch before the increase. We're going to do our stitch into the increase, a chain, and another stitch into that same increase gap. We're then just going to carry on crocheting around. You'll notice your first stitch might be quite tight to get into after the increase. You just want to make sure you're not finishing your stitches too tight when you're doing your increases. Otherwise, you will find that that first stitch after the increase is quite tough to push your hook through. So again, we've reached another one of our increase gaps. We're finishing our last stitch before the increase, then we're going into that gap, doing a stitch, doing a chain, doing another stitch, all into that same gap that we've created from the row before. Again, you can see that I struggled to get my hook through that first stitch after the increase, so just make sure you're not making your stitches way too tight. The next step is really simple. We just want to repeat what we're doing row after row until it's long enough to start sectioning it off into body and arms. So you just want to repeat the steps we've been doing. We want to crochet in the round, increasing at those 4 increase points every row. I like to test the length every now and then when I'm at this stage, so I'll just pop it on over my head, and eventually I like it to reach roughly where my armpits are. So just continue doing all of the same steps until you feel like it's long enough, but you'll see this further through the tutorial. Once you feel like it's big enough and it's at the desired length, you just want to start your row as usual, but just crochet along to your first increase point. Once you're at this increase point, do your normal stitch into the increase point. We're not increasing on this row. We're then going to chain across to the next increase point. I decide to do 10 chains here, but again, this is a personal choice and you may want to do more or less, but do whatever fits you. You may want to chain across and then try it on and see if it feels like the right size. I always like my armpits to be able to breathe. I don't want them to be suffocated by a jumper, so I always feel like 10 across is the right length for me. Once you've got your chain at the desired length, you then want to attach it to the next increase point. So I do this by pushing my hook through that increase point. I then pick up some yarn and pull that through the 2 loops on my hook. Once you've attached your chain to the next increase point, you'll see that we've made one of our armholes. We're then going to carry on crocheting around to the next increase point and repeating this so that we can create both of our armholes and our body hole. So here you can see we've now separated our work into 3 separate holes, our 2 armholes and our main body hole. The rest of this jumper is actually really easy. We're now going to continue crocheting in the round. We're going to do it 3 separate times for our body hole and our armholes. So now we just want to continue crocheting the body of our jumper. The only thing different on this row is that once we reach the armpit, which is our chains, we just want to crochet into those like we did in our initial chain. So we're not really crocheting into stitches, we're crocheting into chains, but that's the only difference on this round. We're also not doing any increases anymore. You can decide to do some decreases if you want to start cinching in your jumper, but I like to normally let these jumpers hang. Hopefully this clip helps to show you what kind of length I like the jumper to be when I introduce the armpit holes. I wouldn't go much shorter than this just because it would start to suffocate your armpits and be like really rubbing up against them. I quite like to have a bit of breathing room, a bit of movement room. So this is the kind of length that I tend to introduce the armpit holes. Once your jumper is at your desired length, you then need to finish off your row. So to finish the row, I always slip stitch into the first stitch, do a chain, and then I pull the yarn through the chain, which creates a knot. We now need to attach yarn back onto our project to create our arms. I create a slip knot and put this on my hook. I then push my hook through a stitch, pick up some yarn from the other side, pull it back through, yarn over and pull that through the 2 loops on my hook. I'm then chaining up just the once because the stitch that I used to attach my yarn already gave some height. So I chained up once and then I continued doing the same half double crochet stitch around all of the open stitches on that armhole. I always attach my yarn under the armpit so that it's hidden and so that the start and end of every row is kind of also on the underside of the arm. I just find it's a little bit more discreet and I like doing it that way. Crocheting the arms is much like doing the body, but just with smaller holes. So we're basically following all of the same steps. So once you reach the end of a row, we're slip stitching into our first stitch, chaining up twice, and turning our work. The only difference with the arms is that I do some decreases, otherwise I do find them quite big and puffy. Obviously it depends what kind of look you're going for, but I just find some decreases really works for me. So basically, to do a decrease, we're gonna yarn over, push our hook through a stitch, pull some yarn back through. We're going to yarn over again, but instead of where we'd usually pull that all through the loops on our hook to create a stitch, we're actually going to yarn over, push through our next stitch, pull some yarn back through again, yarn over again, and pull that through all the loops on our hook. So we're basically doing one big stitch into the 2 stitches of the row before. The number of decreases that you do on your arms is totally up to you and what kind of look you're going for. If you want big puffy sleeves, you may want to do no decreases whatsoever. If you want really tight sleeves, you might want to do loads of decreases straight away and have them really tight and narrow all the way down, or you might want to spread them more gradually. So you might want to do 2 decreases every row for the whole arm, or you might want to do what I did, which is 8 decreases every 2 rows and repeating that 4 times. So basically for the first 8 rows, I decreased 8 times every 2 rows. Once my arms were the length that I wanted them to be, which was 36 rows, I finished them off like I finished the body of the jumper. I'm now actually going to attach my yarn back onto my jumper so that I can do some ribbing. I'm actually attaching my yarn a slightly different way than I did before, just so I could show you this different method. I'm taking my excess yarn from where I finished the sleeve and I'm doing what I think is called a magic knot. I also use this method when changing colours or when I run out of yarn and need to attach more yarn on during the middle of a project. So to do the ribbing, you first want to chain up 11. I chose 11 because I wanted my ribs to be 10 chains long and you need 1 turning chain. So I chose 11 to account for that. You can choose whatever number of stitches you like. You might want slightly smaller ribbed cuffs, you may want no ribbed cuffs at all, which means you can just skip this step, but I always find that 10 is just a nice little number. We're then going to do what I call a single crochet, but what actually might be a double crochet. I think it depends whether you're using US or UK terms. I'm going to carry on calling it a single crochet. We're just going to do that down the length of the chain. You just do this by pushing through your chain, pulling through some yarn, yarning over again, and then pulling that through the 2 loops on your hook. When you get to the bottom of the chain, you then want to do a slip stitch into the stitch that's the end of your sleeve. You then want to do a slip stitch into the next stitch and then do a turning chain and then turn your work back up the chain. Now we're just going to do a single crochet into the back loop. We're not crocheting through both the loops on the stitch. We're just going through the back loop, and this is going to create the ribbed effect. You want to do this for every stitch on the chain except the end one where you're going to go through both the loops because this just creates a nicer finish. So here you can see we're going to go through both of the loops rather than just the back one, and this will just give us a nicer finish when we turn our work. So we're just going to repeat that process to create our ribbed cuffs. I'll just walk you through it quickly again. So first of all, you want to chain up however many long you want your cuff to be. Then you want to single crochet back down that chain to reach the end of your sleeve. Then slip stitch into your sleeve, slip stitch one across, chain up and turn your work. We're then going to single crochet again, but just working through the back loops of those stitches, except for the top stitch where we're going to go through both the loops. Then we're going to chain, go through both the loops again at our top stitch, and then work back down the chain going through the back loops only. Again, we're going to slip stitch into our sleeve when we reach the sleeve, slip stitch one across, chain up again, turn our work, and repeat the steps. Once we've worked all the way around the sleeve, we then want to slip stitch together our first row to our last row. You can do this by pushing through the stitch on your last chain where your yarn is still attached, then pushing through the stitch on the first chain, pulling through the yarn and pulling that through the loops on your hook. So we're just going to do that all the way up the length of that ribbing. So we're pushing through a stitch on our last chain, pushing through a stitch on our first chain, pulling that through, and then pulling that through the loop on our hook. Once you've slip stitched all the way up the ribbed cuff and closed it up nicely, you can then finish it off how we finished off all of our rows before, by finishing with a slip stitch and a chain and then pulling the yarn through to create a knot. You can then cut your yarn and weave it in to hide the loose end, and then we're going to repeat this for the other sleeve and then also for the neckline and the bottom of the jumper. Ribbing is optional, you don't have to do this step whatsoever. I just think it really nicely finishes off the project, but you can just leave the neckline and the sleeves and the bottom of the jumper as they are once you've just finished crocheting the rounds. You can also do ribbing to make different kind of effects. So if you wanted a roll neck jumper, you could do a really long line of ribbing and then fold over the neck so that you've got this nice chunky roll neck. For this jumper, I just decided to do a line of 14, so it's slightly longer than the sleeve cuffs, and I have the option of wearing it as quite a high turtleneck, or I can fold it over for a slightly lower neckline. For the bottom of the jumper, I just matched the sleeves, so I did a chain of 11, which actually resulted in a ribbing of like a 10 chain look. So for the neckline, I actually did a chain of 15 to make a 14 chain ribbed look. And that is the finished jumper. It is so simple and so adaptable. Once you nail it, you can make so many of these jumpers, but they can all look so different. I've probably made about 20 jumpers using this style, but I've done stripes, I've done different colours, different designs, different stitches. You can really change it up once you get the structure of the jumper down. So I hope this helped. I can't wait to see your creations, and I will see you soon.